Hey folks, Happy New Year. It's great to be back working on the channel again. I thought we'd kick off this year with a check-in on the performance of Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. Since my last video on the topic, we've had updates to the sim, updates to GPU drivers, and after all my testing, I'm kind of sat here wondering whether it might be worth ditching 4K. Let me explain. So starting back off in Edinburgh V2 by Pirigi in our Fenix A320, and for quick reference for those that don't know, my PC is made up of an AMD 5800X3D and NVIDIA 4080 Super with 64 gigs of DDR 3600 CL18 memory. We're going to do a takeoff roll here, and in our last video, which I'll link in the description, we had a horrible time getting off the ground. So we're running at 4K with TAA with my preferred graphics settings, which I'll roll across the screen for you now, and it's still pretty awful, isn't it? Well into the mid-20s, which in my experience makes the plane a real handful to keep under control. And as before, we can see that the performance recovers once we get up into the air, which I guess is something. Bringing AutoFPS into the mix has helped a lot. For those that don't know, AutoFPS is a tool that dynamically adjusts your terrain level of detail, among other things, to try and help keep your FPS nice and high while you're on the ground at airports. And look, we're now staying above 30 FPS for the entire takeoff roll, which is really nice, although I'm conscious that the stats there up in the top right are flickering between being limited by our GPU and our main thread. So let's bring some DLSS upscaling into the mix and see if we can lighten that load on our GPU a bit. So we're now running at 4K with DLSS upscaling in performance mode with AutoFPS. Now, I don't like DLSS in the sim right now as it makes the glass cockpits look all fuzzy, but I'm keen to see how our performance differs if we can get that GPU limit out of our way. And yeah, look at that, pretty much at or above 35 FPS for the entire takeoff roll there. So it would seem that at 4K with our preferred settings, our GPU is struggling a bit. So a good result. And look at this, now we're in the air, we're at almost 60 FPS. That's without frame generation, with AutoFPS and DLSS. So what if we ditched AutoFPS and relied solely on DLSS? So without AutoFPS, you can see we're now back down into the 20s, even with DLSS running in performance mode. So it would seem that DLSS and AutoFPS are kind of like the holy grail. You've got AutoFPS dynamically adjusting your graphics settings, the terrain level of detail mostly, which has a massive impact on CPU load and therefore performance, and DLSS keeping your GPU nice and calm. So it does make sense why the two would work so well hand in hand, but we don't really like DLSS super sampling, or at least I don't, as it can make the glass cockpits look very, very smeary. So what about running AutoFPS with frame generation but with no DLSS upscaling? And you can see here we're not doing terribly, flirting with 60 FPS at points here in 4K, but keep in mind a good chunk of those frames aren't real frames. So in terms of data going in and out of the sim via our controls, into our eyeballs, getting that feel of the aircraft, we're essentially in the same situation as we were with running AutoFPS at 4K with TAA. NVIDIA FrameGen is just smoothing out the frame's appearance, not adding new frames with new information from the game engine. Once again, as we get up into the air, the frames increase, and you can see frames now into the 70s, again, albeit with frame generation. I just spun us round and bringing us back into land, and you can see frames are now in the 60s. Again, I appreciate that's with frame generation, but it does feel quite good. I just wish they were actual, honest-to-goodness, real frames. So, given that we've seen DLSS super sampling give us a nice uplift in performance while at 4K, it did get me wondering, is it worth being at 4K in the sim? Could it be worth dropping back to 1440p? So, let's test it out. We're here running at 1440p with AutoFPS running, and you can see we're getting some fairly respectable numbers on the takeoff roll, similar to what we saw when running 4K with DLSS in performance mode. Coupled into my thinking is that if we're going to make use of frame generation in Flight Sim 24, at 4K it doesn't have that same doubling of the FPS effect that it did in 2020, whereas at 1440p it does. I'm not sure if this is a limitation of my 4080 Super, in 4K, or whether it's a more general thing, but at 1440p it does revert back to that nice doubling up of FPS behavior that we enjoyed in 2020. There's also something comforting about not running my PC on the ragged edge at 4K, but rather letting all of my components take a little bit of a breather at 1440p. I don't know, maybe I'm being crazy. But keep an eye on that FPS number now we're up in the air and away, approaching 60 FPS without frame generation. Enabling frame generation with AutoFPS at 1440p sees us with some very high numbers, again essentially doubling our 35 to 40-ish that we had without the frame generation. So we're now up into the 70s and the 80s again. I appreciate these are not real frames, but given that we started, at over 35 FPS without frame gen, it does feel pretty nice once you turn it on. Had we started at, say, 15 FPS and thought, oh well, we'll just get frame gen to double us to 30, it would still feel awful. And again, look at that, once we're up and away, we're now into triple figures. And I know these are fake frames, but it does feel really, really smooth. And just to highlight the importance of AutoFPS, here's the sim running without frame gen, without AutoFPS at 1440p, and you can see we're back into the 20s. So AutoFPS is really, really pulling its weight here. And now let's head over to the default version of JFK with the A330 from iniBuilds, a combo that gave us no end of trouble the last time we tested it out. So we'll start off with 4K without AutoFPS, and you can see we're just about managing to stay above 30 FPS on the takeoff roll, which might not seem that impressive, but if you'll recall the trouble we had the last time we were here prior to the sim being updated, this is a great result, and it seems the sim update's claim of fixing poor performance at certain airports might be proving to be true here. So what if we enable AutoFPS? And you can see that the terrain level of detail has been taken right down via AutoFPS, and we're now hovering around the 35 FPS mark, which is pretty respectable. It's nice to have a little bit of a buffer above 30 FPS. I would much rather dip from 35 FPS to 32 rather than go from 30 to, say, 27. Once again, once we are up in the air, frames improve and AutoFPS can now start to crank that terrain level of detail up. One disadvantage of AutoFPS can be seen particularly well here at New York, because while we're on the takeoff roll, it keeps the terrain level of detail very low to help performance, which means Manhattan in the distance disappears. It's only when we take off that it reappears, so that is one drawback of AutoFPS. So does dropping down to 1440p with AutoFPS help us at all here at JFK? It seems like we're so CPU limited here at JFK that we're not seeing the benefit from the extra GPU headroom at 1440p compared to what we enjoyed when we were at Edinburgh. But all of this has definitely given me pause and makes me wonder if moving to a 1440p monitor for Flight Sim 2024 might not be the worst idea. Let's break it down. My current 4K screen is actually just a cheap 4K TV. It's locked at 60Hz, there's no variable refresh rate, so unless you're at 60 FPS or 30, it can look a bit clunky and a bit teary. Whereas if we went with a 1440p monitor with variable refresh rate, we could choose to, say, cap the sim at 60 FPS, which is fine. And if then, say, the sim could only output 54, well then guess what? We get to see those 54 frames without any tearing. Now, my TV is a 43-inch TV, which I've actually come to quite enjoy in terms of its size. But perhaps maybe a 32-inch 1440p monitor, perhaps on a monitor arm so it can be kind of brought out from the edge of the desk, maybe sort of hover over the back of my yoke there. Might make for a similar feel. I don't know. Let me know what you think. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. Maybe I'm being crazy for even contemplating this. The other thing that would solve all of this, I suppose, would be if Asobo would fix the glass cockpits when DLSS is in use. I do believe it's possible to exclude certain elements from being DLSS upscaled. A lot of game devs use this for menu items and other UI elements that can look a bit odd if they get upscaled with the rest of the game. Now, if the glass cockpit screens were to be excluded from DLSS upscaling, I would consider that case closed for using DLSS. I don't think there would be a reason not to, frankly. It looks fine to me in more or less every other way. It's just those glass cockpits. I can't get over how smeary they look. Anyway, rant over. I hope you found this video useful. I figured I would just, take you guys along for the ride as I kind of revisit Flight Sim 2024 performance. I figured new year, let's see how things are looking. If you found it useful, leaving a like really does help the video a ton, and of course the channel. And yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I think maybe I need to muse on this idea of dropping down to 1440p a little bit before I make any serious moves. Anyway, until next time, take care of yourselves, look after each other. I will see you in the next video, and as always, happy flying.